Night was falling over New York City, and the skyline reflected in the mirrored windows of the skyscraper where Andrew Davis stood, watching the city below. The silence in his luxurious office was interrupted only by the soft clink of ice in his whiskey glass. The scent of fine leather from his chair and the cold steel around him contrasted sharply with the burning sensation rising in his chest. The betrayal was still hard to process. The words of his trusted ally, Samuel, echoed in his mind. They planned everything, Andrew. Michael and Thomas orchestrated your downfall with surgical precision. You're out. The documents scattered across his desk were the tangible proof that those he trusted the most had pulled the rug out from under him. Michael Bennett and Thomas Elliott, lifelong friends and business partners, had schemed to exclude him from the executive control of the very company he had built from the ground up. They knew exactly where and how to strike, exploiting legal loopholes Andrew had overlooked, believing the bonds of friendship were unbreakable. Andrew gripped his glass tightly, but his face remained impassive, trained never to show weakness. His mind, however, was already charting the next step. Silence would be his greatest weapon now. He knew that to confront men as powerful as Michael and Thomas, he needed to be methodical, cold, and ruthless. He rose from his chair and walked slowly toward the window, where the city's night view offered a false sense of serenity. The glow of the lights below contrasted with the growing darkness inside him. They will pay, he thought, already calculating his first moves. There would be no direct confrontations or explosions of rage. Every step would be quiet and devastating. His enemies would never know what hit them. With one last look at the documents, he took a deep breath and left his office, ready to start crafting the plan that would set his revenge in motion. The darkness of his penthouse enveloped him the moment he stepped inside. The silence was deep, unsettling, but Andrew found solace in it. The glass walls surrounded him, as if his life was on display for the city, but at that moment, he felt invisible. Andrew made his way to his private office. Sitting at his desk, he opened his laptop. The glow of the screen highlighted his shadowed features as he began sifting through emails and internal company documents. There, he would find the gaps he needed. While Michael and Thomas celebrated their apparent victory, he was already several steps ahead. The first piece of the puzzle was information. Andrew needed allies who could play at the same level. His former rival, Richard Miller, could be a valuable resource. He knew Richard had his own reasons to despise Michael and Thomas, and the enemy of his enemy would be a valuable, if temporary, ally. The next few hours were spent sketching out the framework of the plan. Andrew mapped out the weak points of his betrayers. Michael had a chain of financial frauds hidden away, while Thomas was involved in an embezzlement scheme that, if exposed, would lead to his public ruin. These would be his first weapons. Yet, as the details took shape, something gnawed at him. Sarah, his wife, had been strangely distant in recent weeks. Although he had been focused on work, he couldn't ignore the signs that something was wrong in their marriage. There was a heaviness in their interactions, a certain evasiveness in her eyes whenever he tried to talk about it. He didn't know how it all connected yet, but he couldn't afford distractions now. As dawn approached, Andrew glanced at the clock and shut down his laptop. The first phase was underway. He knew that from this point on, silence and patience would be his greatest allies. In the war against Michael and Thomas, he couldn't afford to make a single misstep. The soft light of an upscale restaurant in New York City bathed Andrew as he waited patiently for Richard Miller to arrive. Classical music played in the background, blending with the discreet murmur of conversations between other magnates and politicians who frequented the establishment. The air was charged with power, but for Andrew it was just another formality in the game that had already begun. Richard entered with his usual air of superiority. He was a man Andrew had never quite gotten along with, but at this moment he was about to become a strategic ally. After a formal exchange of greetings and a few minutes of superficial conversation, Andrew got straight to the point. Michael and Thomas. They betrayed me, and I know you've got unfinished business with them too. Richard's eyes gleamed for a moment, the mutual animosity between him and Andrew dissolving as he sensed an opportunity. He leaned slightly over the table, his voice low but laden with interest. "What's the plan, Davis?" Andrew knew he couldn't reveal too much at that moment. The trust between them was fragile, built solely on a common enemy. But for now, that was enough. "I need information. Details on Michael's moves over the last few months. I need to know where he's vulnerable." Richard nodded slowly, savoring the temporary power this alliance offered him. "I can get that, but you know there's a price." "I know," Andrew responded without hesitation. "And I'm ready to pay." The conversation continued for a few more minutes, each man carefully weighing what he could give and what he could gain. In the end, they struck a deal. Richard would provide what Andrew needed to weaken Michael, and in return, Andrew would ensure that Michael's downfall would also benefit Richard's interests. As the dinner came to an end, Andrew walked out of the restaurant feeling that the first piece of his puzzle had moved into place. But as he made his way back to his hotel, an uneasy sensation crept over him. The distance between him and Sarah had grown even more in the past few days. Her messages were brief, their phone calls hurried. Andrew wasn't sure if it was simply a reflection of his own detachment or if something darker was at play. Still, he couldn't afford distractions now. Back in New York, Andrew resumed his routine, maintaining a facade of normalcy while the pieces of his plan shifted silently into place. In the comfort of his office, he began to discreetly manipulate the media. It wasn't a simple task, but Andrew had the contacts and influence necessary to plant seeds of doubt in the market. His first move was to leak subtle information about Michael's finances. Small frauds, not catastrophic on their own, but enough to raise questions about his integrity. The public and investors were fickle, and Andrew knew that just one doubt could begin to destabilize the foundation Michael had spent years building. The first articles began to surface. Financial news sites started questioning Michael's practices, and soon, the rumors reached the market. Michael, always so self-assured, was beginning to feel the pressure, though he still had no idea who was behind it all. Meanwhile, at home, the tension between Andrew and Sarah only grew. One evening, she confronted him, her voice filled with frustration. "You're becoming more distant every day, Andrew. What's going on?" He watched her for a moment, carefully choosing his words. Sarah had always been a devoted wife, but lately, something about her had changed. He couldn't prove it yet, but something told him that his own distance wasn't the only cause of their growing rift. "It's work, Sarah. I'm dealing with a complicated situation. This will pass." She sighed, clearly unsatisfied with the answer. "I hope so, because I don't know how much longer I can handle this." Andrew merely nodded, avoiding further discussion. His mind was too focused on what was at stake to deal with the troubles of his marriage right now. However, as he continued to manipulate the chess pieces in his plan for revenge, a shadow of doubt about Sarah began to grow in the back of his mind. The following weeks brought critical progress. Andrew's silent war against Michael and Thomas advanced without them realizing. However, his discomfort regarding Sarah continued to intensify. His instincts told him something was off, and he decided to investigate. It wasn't a step he wanted to take, but the distrust had already taken root. Quietly, he hired a private investigator to keep tabs on Sarah. It was something he never imagined doing, but the distance between them, the evasive looks, and her unexplained absences made it necessary. It didn't take long for his suspicions to be confirmed. One Saturday evening, while Andrew was reviewing documents in his office, his phone rang. It was the investigator. "Mr. Davis, I think you'll want to see this." Andrew took a deep breath before answering. "Send me what you have." Minutes later, he received a series of photos and videos that left him breathless. Sarah was having an affair. And worse, it was with Michael. The images were clear. They met in discreet places, careful not to raise public suspicion. Each photo showed smiles, touches, and an intimacy that Andrew hadn't experienced in his marriage for a long time. The reality hit him like a cold wave. Not only had Michael and Thomas stolen his company, but Michael had also taken Sarah, someone Andrew had trusted more than anyone in the world. The betrayal cut deeper than he could have ever imagined. Sitting in his leather chair, Andrew felt a mix of rage and cold determination. The game had completely changed now. It was no longer just about business with Michael and Thomas. His revenge now included Sarah. Although the pain was there, he knew in that moment that he couldn't falter. His cold, calculating mind took over. The vengeance against everyone involved would be meticulous, leaving no room for error. Silence and patience would remain his deadliest weapons. With the devastating discovery about Sarah and Michael, Andrew accelerated his strategy. The next step would be to push Michael into making irreversible mistakes in his business dealings, using the valuable information Richard Miller had provided. Andrew knew that if he acted at the right moment, he could push Michael into a situation where he would destroy his own empire. Andrew began manipulating confidential information and quietly leaked details about Michael's internal operations to investors and the press. The impact was immediate. Feeling the pressure, Michael made a series of rash decisions to calm investors. But those decisions, instead of stabilizing him, only dug him deeper into a hole. At the same time, Andrew kept Sarah under surveillance, watching her with a mix of cold disdain and bitterness. She continued seeing Michael, oblivious to the fact that Andrew was aware of everything. He would confront her when the time was right, but for now, he allowed her to stay in her illusion of safety. While chaos unfolded in Michael's business, Andrew orchestrated the release of a major financial scandal that had been covered up for months. It was the blow Michael hadn't expected, one that would put his reputation in jeopardy. Thomas, for his part, would also feel the heat, as his involvement in financial fraud would be exposed along with Michael's. On a particularly tense evening, Andrew returned home to find Sarah waiting for him in the foyer. She looked at him, trying to break the ice with a forced smile. "You've been so distant lately, Andrew. What's going on?" He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. There was so much he could say, but he knew it wasn't the right time. "All in good time, Sarah. Just be patient." She hesitated, as if she wanted to ask more, but something in Andrew's voice made her back down. She walked past him as he headed straight to his office, where he could continue moving the pieces in his game of revenge. The trap was almost complete. Soon, Michael, Thomas, and Sarah would fall all together. The morning was cloudy, but the bright flashes of cameras and the murmur of reporters lent a sense of urgency to the headquarters of Andrew's company. An extraordinary shareholders' meeting had been called, and the media presence indicated that something big was about to unfold. Andrew Davis entered the boardroom with his usual calm, confident demeanor. His cold eyes scanned the room, paying particular attention to Michael and Thomas, who sat across from him with expressions oscillating between contempt and nervousness. Sarah was by Michael's side, her presence discreet yet impossible for Andrew to ignore. He now knew the full truth. "Ladies and gentlemen," Andrew began, his firm voice silencing the room, "I believe you are all aware of the rumors circulating in the market over the past few weeks. Fraud, embezzlement, mismanagement. Today, all those doubts will be laid to rest." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Michael and Thomas exchanged uneasy glances. Then, Andrew began presenting the evidence he had meticulously gathered over the past months. Documents, falsified financial records, and emails directly implicating both Michael and Thomas in fraudulent schemes. Each new piece of evidence was a direct blow to the two men, who were now visibly anxious. The final nail in the coffin came when Andrew revealed proof of the millions of dollars funneled into personal accounts by Michael, all covered up by Thomas. The room erupted in whispers and gasps of disbelief as the two former business partners struggled to maintain their composure. "These men," Andrew continued, looking directly at the shareholders and the media present, "have betrayed the trust of this company, its investors, and every employee who has worked tirelessly to ensure our success. I refuse to stand by and watch this happen." By the end of the presentation, there was no room for doubt. Michael and Thomas had been completely exposed. The pressure from the shareholders, combined with the media coverage, was enough to force them to resign from their positions. They lost everything, including the respect and trust of the market. But Andrew wasn't finished. Slowly, he turned his gaze to Sarah, who sat silently in the back of the room, watching the scene unfold with a look of quiet panic. He didn't need to say anything. The fact that she had been at Michael's side during all of this was enough to damn her. Words caught in her throat as she realized the extent of Andrew's knowledge. Her betrayal had been discovered, and now she would face the consequences alongside the other traitors. As the meeting concluded, Michael, Thomas, and Sarah left defeated. Andrew watched them pass by him in silence, his face impassive. His revenge was complete. Not only had he destroyed his enemies in business, but he had also taken down the woman who had betrayed him in the most personal way imaginable. Back in his mansion, Andrew found himself surrounded by silence once again. But this time it was a different kind of silence. There was no longer the weight of revenge to execute, no more plans to craft. Everything was over. He had won, or so it seemed. As he walked through the vast, empty halls of his luxurious home, a sense of hollowness began to settle within him. The grand residence, once a symbol of his power and success, now felt like little more than an empty shell. Sarah was gone, and with her, the last remnants of life in the house had vanished. Andrew knew there was no going back. His revenge was justified, but the price he paid seemed greater than he had anticipated. Sitting on the leather sofa in the main room, Andrew reflected on everything that had transpired. He had reclaimed his empire, ruined those who betrayed him, and restored his reputation in the business world. But at what cost? His family was shattered, his friends were distant, and he was more isolated than ever. The whiskey in his hand no longer provided comfort. The revenge that he had believed would bring him peace now felt like a cold shadow over his soul. Andrew, who had always controlled every detail of his life and his business, couldn't control the overwhelming sense of loneliness that consumed him in that moment. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Richard Miller, the temporary ally who had helped him bring down Michael and Thomas. "Andrew, congratulations. You did it. Now, about our future partnership." Andrew hung up without responding. He had no energy to think about new alliances or business opportunities. All he wanted now was silence. But the silence he found offered no relief. The price of revenge had been solitude, and that was a debt he wasn't sure he could repay. Several weeks had passed since the final showdown, but for Andrew, each day felt like a repetitive void. He continued to attend business meetings, lead his company with his usual efficiency and coolness, but the satisfaction that had once driven him was gone. The victory he had sought so fiercely now seemed meaningless. One quiet afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived. Richard Miller appeared at his penthouse, unannounced, with a proposal for international expansion. "Andrew, you dismantled the traitors brilliantly, but the business world doesn't stop, and you have a rare opportunity to expand your empire. Think about what we could build together." Andrew studied Richard, considering his words. There was a time when the prospect of such a powerful partnership would have ignited his ambition. But now, something inside him hesitated. He had conquered everything he wanted, but at the cost of losing something far more valuable: the connection to the people around him and, perhaps, to himself. "What do you really want, Miller?" Andrew asked, direct as ever. "You know what I want, Davis. We're going to dominate the global financial market. You and me, with no one to stop us." Andrew stood and walked toward the window, looking out at the city he knew so well. New York was still there, vibrant, full of life. He knew he could easily continue down the path of success and power. But for the first time in a long while, he wondered if that's what he truly wanted. "I'll think about it, Miller, but don't push me." Richard nodded, realizing that Andrew might not be as eager as before to expand his business empire. As he left, Andrew was left alone with his thoughts once again. Andrew returned to his sofa and looked out at the horizon. He had a decision to make: continue walking the lonely path of power and revenge, or find a new way to live, one that wasn't defined by the desire to control and destroy. As night fell over the city, Andrew knew that no matter which path he chose, he would never be the same man he once was.